Well, good morning, Larry.
Good morning, Tom.
How are you this morning?
I am good this morning, and
Well,
welcome to another edition of Conversation at First Baptist Church.
Well, I appreciate the invitation for what you're doing to help us learn more about each other.
Absolutely. As I was telling you earlier, Jesse Brown made the comment to me about, I don't know some of the people here, and I said, I don't either. So that's how this got started.
It's quite a risk for us to move to another side of the church.
It is.
So I appreciate it. You're doing this and letting us learn about folks and their history and everything about them.
Well, it has certainly been interesting, but I have a few questions for you.
All right. Well,
So tell me about where you grew up and what life was like for a little boy in Minnesota.
I grew up in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, and that's the central part of the state. Minnesota is known for over 10,000 lakes, but also Minnesota has hundreds of thousands of wetland areas, shallow water areas. So growing up in Minnesota, I had a chance to be outdoors quite a bit. Had two brothers, sister, and my father would take us out hunting. And I was allowed to carry a BB gun, and we would walk the cornfields trying to scare up some pheasants. And then later I started duck hunting. And Minnesota's a beautiful place with rolling hills, farm fields, woodlots, but water everywhere. And with that water comes a great abundance of life. We saw ducks and geese and swans. I remember one evening, my father called us outside and said, look, there's geese migrating over the house. And that was an unusual observation to see geese at that time. So it was really great. I spent a lot of time outdoors. When I got a bicycle, I would go out and travel and visit wetland areas. I would dress in camouflage. I could do a little bit of squirrel hunting and was quite successful at it. I went to middle school and high school in Minnesota. I remember several teachers quite well. I remember my 7th grade science teacher taking us out on a field trip to a wetland area. And we visited this wetland and we sampled the invertebrates. We saw the dragonflies, the dragonfly larvae. I remember catching some salamanders and some frogs, and I thought, this is great. Well, the next year in 8th grade, a different science teacher taught a class in the afternoons and evenings, and it was on trapping, and another class was on duck hunting. So it gave us the finer points. How do you trap animals? Well, what interested me in trapping animals was the fur prices. In the early 1970s, fur prices were quite high, and I could trap a muskrat from a wetland area and make $4 to $5 from that pelt. And I could trap a mink and make maybe $25. And then once in a while, I would even trap beaver and otter, and then fox and raccoon. So we had a regular fur buying operation in our basement, but it also made for a really interesting diet. My mother was just an outstanding cook, and she would cook some of the items that I would bring in. And one of our favorites was squirrel. We really liked eating rabbit as well. But then every once in a while, we would try something different, like muskrat and beaver. Those weren't my favorite. I think I could live off those if I had to, but not nearly as tasty as chicken or a good steak.
As a little boy, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. I knew that in the 6th grade. I wanted to be a wildlife biologist and to work to help animals and to help improve their habitats. And it was amazing, quite a journey becoming a wildlife biologist. First of all, there's the naysayers. You say, I want to be a wildlife biologist. And the naysayers go, there aren't any jobs. There's only a few jobs and they're with the government. You're not going to get a job. So what do? They said, well, get a lot of experience. Well, this 7th grade science teacher, Mr. Schmidt, he said, Tom, I think you should become a biologist. And I want you to write the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and ask about careers. So in 7th grade, I wrote this letter to the Minnesota DNR, and believe it or not, they responded. And I marvel at that to this day, that they would have sent a response to a 7th grader and said, here's what you need to do. You need a lot of experience. You need to get good grades in school. And then you need to be willing to move anywhere in the nation to get this job. So I started studying harder, paying more attention to what the teachers were saying, and I started getting different jobs. My first job was a paper route. My brother, Paul, my twin brother, and I had a paper route with the St. Paul Dispatch and Pioneer Press. And we would deliver papers door to door. And that taught me to wake up early. That taught me to wake up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And then we'd go out there on any morning, whether it was raining or snowing and ice, and we would deliver these papers, hundreds of papers. And then the evening after school, we would have this paper route. And then on Sunday, that was the huge paper. I mean, that thing must have weighed 3 pounds. And we had hundreds of these delivered. And my father would wake up early Sunday morning, and he would drive near us with the papers in the car, and then we would go back and forth to the car and deliver the papers. And I marvel at that, because then we would go to church for 8 o'clock service. So we'd have all these papers delivered, and we'd be in church at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, then I started getting different jobs. And different jobs, my first job was cooking hamburgers at a Red Barn restaurant. And I remember that job, $1.60 an hour. Well, I was pumping gas at Erickson's gas station. And a friend of mine drove by in his vehicle. He had a Mustang. And he said, Tom, I've got a volunteer opportunity for you. It's at the Cedar Creek Natural History area. And he said, what we're going to do, he says, is there's a graduate student there who needs help with a badger research project. And he said, what I'd like you to do is to drive up to Cedar Creek and visit with this graduate student, Rick Lampy, and let him know about yourself. So I went up there and I talked to Rick Lampy, and he said, I have a volunteer position. I need somebody who can trap badgers, put radio collars on them, and follow them. But I have no money to pay you. Well, I went home that afternoon and I said to my mom and dad, here's my first opportunity to work as a biologist, but it's a volunteer position. They said, do it. They said, we'll help you out as much as we can. So I went and I worked with Rick Lampy, and I got to trap pocket gophers and badgers and follow them. The position turned into a paid position. So over the next couple of years, I had 20 different jobs. But my favorite was working with Dr. L. David Meach. And this was in northern Minnesota. And I was able to trap timber wolves, and I was able to trap bear and put radio collars on them. So this went on, all these different temporary jobs. And again, the naysayers were saying, you're not going to get a job in the field. This isn't going to happen. They're not hiring wildlife biologists. Well, I had a job as a technician working at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge in Minnesota, and this was a job just before Dee and I were to get married. They laid me off a day before we got married. I thought, oh no, Lord, this is the job I really like. I was working with wetlands, with wildlife, and now I have no job, and we're getting married. How in the world are we going to make a living? Am I going to have to go back to selling shoes? Am I going to have to go back to pumping gas? What am I going to do? So here we were on our honeymoon, and we didn't have any money. We were staying in a cabin on the north shore of Lake Superior, and there was no TV, no phone in that cabin. We'd go out during the day and take hikes and just do a lot of visiting and play games. Came back one afternoon from a hike, and there was a note on the door. And the note said, Tom, call your mother. And I thought, oh no. Something's wrong with my dad. Maybe my mom's sick. So I went to the phone they had in the office, and I called home, and my mother said, there's an envelope here from the U.S. Forest Service. Do you want me to open it? I said, yes. She opened it, and it was a job offer to be a wildlife technician. And the location was 1 hour away from where we were honeymooning on the Superior National Forest. And that started my career in wildlife. 3 years later, I was advanced into a wildlife biologist job. Trust in Jesus. Pray. Have that faith. Miracles will happen. So I've worked as a wildlife biologist really since 1979. After 34 years, I retired from the Forest Service. I have my own business now where I'm helping people to restore wetlands and streams and to help the environment. And I'm teaching people how to do this. Well, I want to tell you about Dee. Dee and I met in high school. And most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. And the greatest personality. I thought, oh, she is unbelievable. But she is way out of my league. Here I was like 80 pounds, skinny, just, I don't think I was much to look at. Got married, 2 wonderful children, Eric and Emily, and we have 3 grandchildren. And it's great when they come over to visit us. We have a farm. It was Dee's dream not only to marry me, but to have a farm. Well, Larry, I'd like to tell you about Twisted Arm Farm. In 1997, Dee and I bought the farm. Our hobbies have become home repair, home renovation, chopping wood. We built a barn together. We have goats. We have chickens, many chickens, and cats and dogs. And she even has a Fowler's toad, an American toad, and an eastern box turtle in the house, in a terrarium. So when the grandchildren come to visit, we have 3 of them. They can go fishing in our pond. They can catch frogs in the wetland areas. And now we have one of these pedal boats that you can go around the pond, just like you're pedaling a bicycle, and catch fish.
I've been out to the farm, and it is a gorgeous place. I've taken some fantastic photos out
You
there.
have. You've
It
taken
is
some
so
wonderful
beautiful.
photos. In fact, we had some renovation done, and they did a commercial and featured Dee, and they used some of the photos you had taken.
So growing up, what was a traditional meal? You know, most families,
Okay.
the table is where they
We
come
went
together.
to church every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. Then there was Sunday school afterwards. And when you'd come home, everybody would be really hungry. So my mother was so organized, she would wake up probably at 6 o'clock, and she would put lunch in the oven on Sunday. And it would generally be a pot roast. But then, of course, we would have the squirrel that I would harvest, and we would have the rabbits, and of course the pheasants and the grouse were a delicacy. And when I would shoot a deer, we would have deer to eat. And my mother was always willing to help cook these unique items. But I think one of the least favorite was probably the muskrat. We only had that meal once. Decided we weren't going to eat that anymore. We didn't have to. But yes, good variety of food in Minnesota. Everything has cream sauce on it. A lot of Norwegian influence. I remember eating sauerkraut, pickled herring, and smoked fish. One doesn't find smoked fish very often in Kentucky, but in northern Minnesota, you have smoked Cisco, smoked salmon, smoked whitefish, smoked trout, and really, if you smoke meat, it really adds the flavor, really good.
So what brought you to Morehead, Kentucky?
I was working with the U.S. Forest Service as a wildlife biologist on the Superior National Forest. And this was in northeastern Minnesota. They had a reorganization. And they wanted us to move to Ely, Minnesota. And it's far north, and there's a lot of snow. And Dee didn't want to go to Ely. She had been to Ely, and literally it's at the end of the road, winter 9 months out of the year. I wanted to go to Ely, but she said, no. She said, if we're going to move, let's move a great distance. So we pulled out the National Geographic magazines, and we looked at states where we thought we might want to live. And I watched the job announcements with the U.S. Forest Service, and a wildlife biologist job opened up in Morehead, Kentucky. And I inquired about it, and they said it's a beautiful area, just beautiful, with all the hills and the small mountains and the streams. And I thought we'd be here 2 or 3 years, but we fell in love with Kentucky, the people, our church, and we said, you know what, we're not going to move. We're at the Holiday Inn, and we were going to another church on Sundays, and we were not real happy with it. The preacher did a lot of yelling. So Waverly and Dolores Jones were operating the Holiday Inn, and they said, why don't you come to First Baptist Church? And I said, well, wait a minute. We're raised Lutheran, and you want us to come to a Baptist church? Well, yes, we welcome everyone, and we're friendly. So we came to First Baptist Church, and we knew right away this is our church home. So if you come to First Baptist Church, you may receive the best entertainment ever. You may have that opportunity to see and hear Harvey Pennington, Larry Albert, and Leanne Coyle Carr perform. And they have this bluegrass group, and it's just wonderful. And then there's a good chance you'll hear Aaron speak, our preacher. He gives the best sermons. You're not going to fall asleep. You're going to remember. You're going to want to take notes during that sermon. And we have this wonderful food just before Sunday school in the morning. My wife Dee will make all this food, and you don't have to eat breakfast because breakfast is provided when you come to Sunday school in the morning. And then you can walk right up and go to church. It's a beautiful sanctuary.
I have asked others about have you encountered Bigfoot or seen ghosts and so forth?
Larry, I'm glad you asked that question. And it's a serious question. I see ghosts every day. The ghosts of drained wetlands. I have learned how to identify a wetland after it's been filled and drained. When I'm driving down the highway, I see the ghosts of the drained wetlands, the shadows on the landscape. And they all speak to me and say, we need to be restored to provide habitat once again to plants and animals. And if I had a chance to go back in time, I would go to Geneva, New York. And Geneva, New York in 1838. And that's when John Johnston installed the first drain tiles to drain a wetland. And he taught people all over North America how to drain wetland areas. And I would meet with John Johnston and say, now, John, this wetland area here is providing great habitat for frogs, toads, salamanders, ducks, geese. Maybe you don't want to drain every single wetland on your farm. Maybe you can manage your farm a little differently and grow food and wildlife at the same time. I don't know if he'd listen to me, but I'd give it a try. You never know.
Well, it would certainly be worth the effort. Tom, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. You have answered every question that I had prepared for you.
Well, we could go on and on, but I don't think anyone would listen. They might.
Well, I don't know.
But I really thank you for organizing this series.
Well, thank you, Tom. I've enjoyed it and learned so much about the people in the congregation.
And I wish you every blessing as you continue doing this.
This is Larry Dixon, and this has been a conversation with First Baptist Church. With me today has been Tom Biebighauser. Tom, it's been a pleasure.
And likewise. Thank you.